Well, that took longer than I expected. I did write the stories that I promised, though. I've got 3 of them written and available to read online, and I'll have links in the video description so that you can read them if they sound interesting to you. A while back, I asked my viewers for suggestions for short stories for me to write. I'll write a short story on a whim. And to prove the point, here's what I'm going to do. I want people to suggest short stories for me to write in the comments section. At the time that I made my first video, I worried that I wasn't going to get enough suggestions to use. I don't have very many subscribers. And I did get enough suggestions, but just barely. I got 4 total. One of them doesn't show up. It was deleted or it's unavailable for some reason. I have no idea. And I failed to save a screen cap of it, so I can't show it to you. But what the person wanted was a short story about a job interview, in which it's never actually stated that it's a job interview. And I'll admit I kind of cheated, because the idea that I came up with that I decided it was worth writing wasn't going to work that way. It stated that the woman is showing up for a job interview right off. But it is a story I would not have written without that suggestion, so it still counts. Of the 3 stories that I wrote, it was by far the easiest. There are links to it that you'll find below the video, both on Minds and on my blog on WordPress. The second short story that I wrote is the one that took the most effort, and it was offered to me by someone who calls himself Godless Cranium. I like Cranium a lot. He runs a blog that I used to read, and he has a YouTube channel that I leave comments on. And we've had a couple debates online on Twitter and so forth. He's a real good guy, and I once quipped under one of his videos that he's never done anything to really piss me off and earn my enmity. And that's really changed. Not because he disagreed with me on how hard short stories are to write, and he did. He says, well, I don't know that he disagreed, but he explained, I think short stories make you choose your words with more care, and that's why some people say short stories are harder to write. Yeah, I understood the concept. That's bullshit, though. You have to choose your words with care even if you're writing a novel. I will back off on my statement in my earlier video that short stories are not hard to write. Usually they're not, and that is true. But every so often they can be hard, and this is an example of a story that was reasonably hard to write. Not as hard as a novel, but I wouldn't go so far as to call it easy. And that's what Cranium has done to irritate me. He chose the worst of all possible suggestions. He couldn't possibly have known. It's not his fault. But I wrote a time travel story once. A novel called Paradox Eclipse, the little half-sun, half-moon that you see in the icon that I use sometimes. That's from the book cover. Paradox Eclipse was excruciating to write. It was agony. It was torture. Because in that story, the time machines are used over and over and over, and the timeline changes again and again. And any time I realized I had to include a detail earlier on or make a change, I wasn't just changing one sequence of events, but dozens of them. And it was so incredibly difficult to keep all the dates and all the times and all the events and all the causes and effects in order that I swore to myself when it was over that I would never write a time travel story ever again. Now, I don't know what kind of cruel instincts Godless Cranium has to suggest a time travel story. But in my first video, I threw out a few examples just to give people ideas of, what kind of directions I might go. Make it car crash, or time travel, or first date, whatever it happens to be. If you want a little bit more detail, that's fine. It can be car crash on the way home from church, or car crash involving a family of 5, or time travel involving aliens, or time travel to the prehistoric past, or first date with a coworker. I didn't expect anyone to throw any of those ideas back at me. And if I had, I sure as hell would not have said time travel. I guess it's my fault. But you had 3 choices and you had to go with time travel? I like the time travel with aliens idea. Well, I was going to leave that the hell alone. Unfortunately, I came up with an idea for a story without trying. And it was a good enough idea I decided to run with it. But the The story that I wrote is called They Can't Tell Time. The idea is that an alien visits Earth repeatedly, talking to a pair of human beings. And what the alien doesn't realize is that his method of travel, he doesn't travel using a spaceship, he travels using an interstellar signal. But traveling through space using that method also moves him through time. He doesn't show up in chronological order. So the first time he's met the two human beings is the 5th time that he's met them from his point of view. His sequence of events is completely at random from on Earth. And that causes all kinds of problems with the things he says, the things that he should know and the humans should know, and so on. There are 2 men in black that are chasing him around that do understand that and explain it to the audience. But it's a fun enough story. And again, I've got a link to that story, They Can't Tell Time, both on Minds and on my blog. So if you'd care to read it, that's where you'll find it. The third story I wrote, though, is the one that interested me the most. It's not the one I put the most effort into. That was the time travel story. But Plain Speech came up with an interesting idea, more interesting than he could possibly have guessed. Oh, and by the way, Plain, thank you for confirming that novels are harder to write than short stories, because he's a fellow writer. But the idea that he wanted me to write was a bridge collapse involving 2 utility workers who detest each other. And that really caught my attention, because I was already writing what's not a novel, but a novella, that I'm also making available online, piece by piece. I'll release it as a serial, and I'll have a link to it down below as well. But the story that I'm writing is called the Deicide Files. It's about a detective, a private eye in the land of the gods, in a city of the gods called Pantheon City, who is investigating the murder of a god. And in that story, my Detective Axiom, his investigation, and I had written this prior to receiving the suggestion, but Detective Axiom, his case was linked to a bridge collapse from 80 years ago. A collapsed bridge. That was something I had already written, and here, Plain Speech offered me the suggestion that I should write about a bridge collapse. So, instead of just writing about any bridge, I wrote about a bridge in the land of the gods, the very same bridge that Detective Axiom will look into 80 years later. The 2 stories, even though they're related, you really don't have to read the one to understand the other. But the story that I've written is called The 3 Buddha Bridge. And again, I'll have links to it in the description so you can read it in either place, along with the Deicide Files if it captures your attention. But for those of you who offered story suggestions, I hope you do enjoy them. Please tell me whether you did or didn't, and anyone else for that matter. Thank you for your cooperation, and I enjoyed this enough that I might actually do it again at some point in the future, but probably not anytime soon.